Welcome to The Voice of Retail. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc. This podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Retail Council of Canada. My very special guest on this episode is Sir Ronald Cohen, a pioneering philanthropist, venture capitalist, private equity investor, and social innovator. And now with his new book, Impact, Reshaping Capitalism to Drive Real Change, a best-selling author. In a fascinating and wide-ranging conversation, commensurate with the scope, scale, and, well, the impact of Impact Capitalism, Sir Ronald takes us through a vivid career, launched from Oxford and Harvard, into essentially creating the private equity industry in the UK. He then lays out the principles of investing with impact and how consumers and retailers can participate in one of the biggest movements in modern society to reform our value system.
If you point your phone, which you can now do in France through an app called U.K at a food product or a cosmetic product, you can find out what positive or negative impact that the company bringing you the product is delivering.
Let's listen in now. Sir Ronald, welcome to the Voice of Retail podcast. How are you doing this morning?
Very well, Michael. Good to be with you.
Well, it's morning where I am. I think you mentioned you were today. I was going to ask you where you were because it looks like you travel between Tel Aviv and New York and London. It sounds like you're in France today.
Yeah, managed to get away for a brief holiday in the south of France.
Well, wonderful. Well, thank you for interrupting your holiday to talk to me. That's really kind of you. I'm really looking forward to our interview. I've had a couple of interviews with people and thought leaders who have talked about different forms of capitalism. I don't know if you know, you're in France, Hubert Joly, who is the CEO of Best Buy.
Of course I do, yes.
And I talked to him about his great book, and his journey from, the hardcore McKinsey consultant into a new form of capitalism, very people-centric. And Roger Martin, he talks about a different, way that capitalism. So I'm really looking forward to this. So really, we're going to talk about your book, Impact. We're going to talk about a bit about yourself. Why don't we start there? You've got a long and vivid career, founder, private equity, author. Give the listeners a sense of your background.
So, Michael, life is difficult to predict. In my case, at the age of 11, I was kicked out of Egypt as a refugee and landed in the UK with my parents. I couldn't speak English. I got education at the cost of the state in a grammar school, and then a teacher believed in me called Richard Farley, a history teacher, extremely widely read. He thought I should go to Oxford. He prepared me for the entrance exams, and thanks to him, I got in. And then from there, I got a scholarship to Harvard Business School. And I suppose it's a sort of given me a sense of gratitude for having been helped along the way. And therefore, I'm motivated by a similar sense of helping others in need.
You stayed connected to academics, too. I wrote that you were on some governing boards or connected to Harvard, right? So you've stayed at a governance level connected to education, yeah?
Yes, I have, both with Oxford and with Harvard. I served on the board of overseers for 6 years at Harvard, which looks at all the academic activities of the university. And then I was on the board of the Harvard Management Company, which manages its $40 billion endowment.
Well, I was going to say, talk about an endowment, and let's talk about your experience in private equity. Your book is Impact, Reshaping Capitalism to Drive Real Change. Clearly, capitalism in one form or another has worked for you. You've been very successful. Talk about your private equity experience and the companies that you started, just to give the listeners a bit of context.
Sure. So when I was in my early 20s, I was at Harvard Business School, and I sensed something was in the air. And it's what became known as venture capital. And I was lucky to be in my 20s when the tech revolution and venture capital began their rise. And then later I got into the world of private equity. So from having backed companies like the company which cloned Dolly the sheep and Virgin Radio and some tech companies, Apple and AOL, were backed by my US partner, Alan Patrikoff. I also added to that private equity, so investing in big companies or bigger companies, and improving their efficiency. And what had driven me to go to both of these activities was a desire to do good and do well at the same time. At the time when I got into venture capital, the UK had millions unemployed. This was a way of creating jobs. I suppose as the years went by, I realized I was giving people with no money the opportunity to become wealthy, successful entrepreneurs and to enrich people around them. But it wasn't reducing the gap between rich and poor. And that is something that I began to focus on from 20 years ago, from the year 2000.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, and I've had the opportunity to read your book, and you touch on Adam Smith, for example, about how the invisible heart and the invisible hand, and you remind me of what he talks about enlightened self-interest.
Right.
Was that your guiding principle, or was it something different?
No, it was my guiding principle, but it turns out that Adam Smith was prouder of his first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. I actually have a copy near my desk, which was about altruism and how human nature leads people to have empathy towards others and to help them, than he was about The Wealth of Nations, which introduced the invisible hand of markets. And what we've realized with economies that seek profit only is that they create terrible damage along the way. They do help to create growth and to bring people up from poverty.
Yeah.
But they do create terrible environmental damage and often terrible social damage along the way. And so I began to work 20 years ago on this idea of bringing investment to people who want to improve lives. And I realized when we invented the social impact bond in 2010, after 10 years of effort, and the social impact bond, as you may know, Michael, is a security where your return as an investor depends on achieving an improvement. In the case of the first social impact bond, a reduction in the number of young people going back to jail.
Right.
And that was really the first time we had a financial instrument that optimized risk, return, and impact. And with the years, I began to realize our whole economies are going this way. When I chaired the G8 task force, I began to realize that ESG investing, which was then at $10 trillion, today it's at $40 to $70 trillion, was trying to do the same thing, risk, return, and impact. And when you looked at investors signing up to the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment, the figure was 40 trillion. Today it's over 100 trillion. And so we coined the phrase, the invisible heart of markets, in 2014 to say, look, if you measure impact and bring it to the center of your economies, then you bring businesses to bring solutions, to do good and to do well, instead of creating problems. And so impact is the invisible heart of markets that guides Adam Smith's invisible hand.
To stay in the realm of economics, the concept of economic rents are something I think about a lot. Particularly in the retailer's line of business, you have to be careful of as you say, the impact of what consumers are asking and what you're delivering, right? The so to speak, the damage. Maybe there's the societal damage or whatever, unintended consequences. But still, is this also what you hope to resolve or hope to guide through, right?
Totally. So I see three major forces today at work to change the world and actually to improve it hugely. The first is a massive change of values to which you've referred. And retailers, like everyone else, are aware of it. People don't want to buy anymore in the way they used to, goods from companies creating harm or to work for them. Investors realize this, and we have these trillions of ESG money flowing now to companies that create less harm or preferably create some positive good. There's a second force of technology, artificial intelligence, machine learning, augmented reality, the genome and computing, which enable us to do things we've never been able to do before, that deliver impact. So you think of what we've begun to witness through COVID, communications through Zoom, telemedicine, teleeducation, and so on and so forth. And then the third force, using this technology to measure the impacts of companies in a granular way. And this comes to the answer to your question.
Do you see these ideas, concepts starting to go into the minds of consumers? Like the paradox is consumers on one hand love to know where products are made, and more have are invested in the products, but at the same time they're looking for sometimes the best value, the cheapest price, and sometimes those things are a bit of a disconnect. Do you see a disconnect at the society level?
I actually don't see a disconnect, because if you point your phone, which you can now do in France through an app called U.K at a food product or a cosmetic product, you can find out what positive or negative impact that the company bringing you the product is delivering. And that enables us to make discriminating choices. There's often no difference in price level. I'll give you an example. I'm British, I drink tea. If you look at a box of Twinings tea, and you know the numbers, because you can point your phone at it and get it. We're not quite there yet with regard to Twinings tea, I don't think. But you realize Associated British Foods creates $1.8 billion of damage a year environmentally, and makes $1.6 billion of profit. So you move along the shelf and you go to Lipton's, which is made by Unilever, which has a much better environmental record. So I think we're on the verge now of apps that enable us to do that for a very wide range of products. And in the next 2 or 3 years, in my view, we will have apps that enable us to do this for virtually every product.
Interesting. Let's talk about your book for a second. As I said, it's Impact, Reshaping Capitalism to Drive Real Change. What prompted you to write the book? Did you think there was a gap on the shelves? What, after all this, you just had a book, you needed to put it out there? Talk about that.
What prompted me to write the book, Michael, was a sense of urgency. We cannot continue to do things in the way we're doing. Creating huge problems for the planet. We were chatting about the weather changes that Canada has experienced, where you're based, and the social issues, the inequalities that come from the employment practices of companies. And I felt that the work I had been doing from 2000 to 2010 and the social impact bond had brought this paradigm shift of 2000, since 2000, of shifting from risk-return economies to risk-return impact economies. And what's driving that is the actions of investors today. Investors are changing the behavior of companies. And I thought, look, if I can explain this simply, then if people shift to understanding what's happening in the world, it will accelerate the process, and we will get sooner to a world that has a built-in capacity to improve itself instead of creating and aggravating problems.
Where did capitalism go wrong? When I think back to the last century and a half, I think of the halcyon days of a strong middle class in America, for example, after the Second World War. But capitalism seems to more and more be serving very few. And where did it go wrong? Where did that stay? This isn't a history lesson podcast, but in your mind, how did it come off the rails and be so? It feels very distorted right now. A lot of winners, like it's a win-lose economy. How did we get here?
Well, at the most basic level, you could cope with the consequences of capitalism when they were reasonable. Mm-hmm. With globalization, even governments can't cope with them. Like governments can't cope with climate change, or governments can't cope with social inequality, right? The system just keeps aggravating both. So the fact that the consequences are so huge makes it go wrong. You can't continue like this. However, we've also had the arrival of technology, and technology requires a lot of training for you to be able to get a job or be successful in it. And so that's led to disparities in remuneration between those who've benefited from a very technical education and others. At the same time, we've had very cheap financial markets. That's enabled anybody in finance to make a ton of money. And then these huge sums have spilt over into the remuneration of corporate executives. And so you find the multiple of salary, of the average salary within a firm, go from 42 times between the CEO and either the average or the lowest employee to over 300 times over a period of 20, 25 years. So these two things together are now stressing the planet and societies around the world.
Yeah, I've heard it say. Roger Martin I talked to Roger Martin about this, and he focuses a lot on understanding distortions in payment and leadership, and things like financial structures, like options and these things, and just other tax structures seem to have really distorted that top level compensation in certain parts of the world. That feels like a big contributor too. Right?
I think that's sort of come in from the private equity industry into mainstream business, because the private equity industry was competing for management talent with big companies, and big companies had to start adjusting in order to hold on to that talent.
I think about libertarianism and your version of impact capitalism. Are they opposites? Where on that spectrum do you see? I mean, when I think of Silicon Valley, I think of a lot of libertarianism, and I think that's driven a lot of things, and in venture capital too. Do you see these two as opposites? Is your impact capitalism a solve for that?
I think they are at opposites today. I think those who worry about only risk return are at opposite with those who worry about risk return impact. Because they're in danger of aggravating our social and environmental issues. And the ESG and impact investment flows that we see, and the impact entrepreneurs like Elon Musk, who are disrupting industries today, are seeking to bring solutions as well as make money.
Yeah, you call him in the book the best known impact entrepreneur, and I was surprised at that. You unpack it as in, because he's created an electric automobile industry, basically, he has had more impact than pretty much anyone. He does other things, which are, a little bit more libertarian, but he still fits in your model?
He fits in my model because his motivation for getting into the automobile industry wasn't just to make money. His motivation was to bring a better engine, an electric engine that reduces the pollution from cars. And he single-handedly changed the product offerings of every automobile company in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, undeniably, right? Undeniably. I can't have you on the mic. Last couple of questions. I can't have you on the mic without getting your feedback and thoughts around this COVID era. Has it changed? Has it accelerated, as it has many things? Has it accelerated people's and the industry's focused on impact capitalism? How do you think about what just happened to us and what continues to happen in many parts of the world?
I think it's been a huge accelerator. Like in 18 months, we've had 10 years worth of acceleration in the use of technology, in the concern about the environment, in the concern about social issues, perhaps because we've been stuck at home. A sense of solidarity has grown, which makes people feel that you have to do things that are in the common good. And it's very interesting that the millennial and Gen Z members of our population today account for 60% of the U.S. workforce. So we've got a massive change of values, which has been accelerated by COVID. And I think it presents us with an opportunity now to take some bold steps in shifting our economies to become impact economies. The major one is really to mandate that all companies publish impact-weighted accounts that reflect in currency terms, in dollar terms, the impacts companies create through their operations on the environment, through their employment practices on people, and through their products on people and the environment. And I hope that either the EU or the US administration or some of the European countries or Canada, which have thought a lot about this change in economic paradigm, will take the bold step now of mandating transparency on impact, because it is that which will harness the force of investors to change the behavior of companies.
I also think about harnessing the power of consumers. Of course, I think about retail a lot, which is very consumer driven. You talked about the idea of being able to scan two types of tea and understanding different impacts. Is that really what it's going to take? Is it government's role to mandate it, and then the consumer has to actually adopt that as in real terms in terms of how they make choices?
Yeah, I mean, it started like that, Michael. This whole thing started with young consumers changing their preferences for the products they buy. And it began to shift from consumers and talent to investors. After that, consumers are crucially important, which is why the arrival of these new apps that enable you to become aware of the impacts products create or the companies that manufacture them create is going to be so significant. This revolution is going to be driven by consumers, talent, and investors. Some business leaders realize its importance and, like the arrival of technology, don't want to be disrupted by the arrival of impact when they're creating negative impact. But it's being driven by consumers, talent, and investors.
So I guess that transparency or visibility to the impact is one step. Thinking a couple of levels down, so to speak, many retailers have very robust and comprehensive CSR initiatives, corporate social responsibility initiatives. Any advice for the listeners around how to think about those in the context of your theory around capitalism and impact capitalism? Are they close cousins to each other? Is it just a matter of degree?
No, they're distant. They're distant cousins, very distant cousins. CSR is a branch of philanthropy. Impact investing, or impact entrepreneurship for that matter, involves the intention to create impact and the measurement of the impact created. So it uses investment capital, entrepreneurship, innovation, and so on. CSR, frankly, has become viewed as a marketing tool of companies, a way for companies to spread money around relevant communities and increase their popularity. It isn't going to change the world, and companies are understanding this.
You open your book, which I think I know how long it takes to get books from your hand and onto the market. You open your book with a quick opening because I think it was released just as COVID was starting to impact, and you made a wish basically at the beginning of the book saying, "I hope governments do the right thing in terms of how they handle the economy and take care of people first." I'm summarizing, of course, a little bit. How would you, again, now we've got 18 months of experience. You've seen how governments have handled this crisis. How would you rate them on, going back to your academics, would you give them A to F? How would you rate governments globally?
I think governments have become aware of ESG and impact and the need to measure impact. But I don't think they've understood fully just how much they need it. Governments are coming out of COVID with huge debt. Their budgets are hugely constrained. At the same time, the scale of the social and climate issues they face is unparalleled. And so they need to bring the private sector, investors and businesses and entrepreneurs and consumers and talent alongside them to help bring solutions to achieve their goals. And so I'm hopeful that with the G7 under the UK's presidency today establishing an impact task force to look at impact transparency and integrity and how we boost impact capital flows, how we bring impact measurement to ESG, that 40 to 70 trillion dollars that is flowing now. I'm hopeful the governments will now begin to seize this issue in earnest. Now you hear the SEC making pronouncements about environmental transparency. You see the EU introducing taxonomies, as they call them, to differentiate between industries that create negative impact and those that don't. But we need them to go a lot further than that. We need them to say, as Roosevelt said in 33, we're going to establish generally accepted impact principles. Then it was financial accounting principles.
Yeah.
To give transparency on the impacts of companies, now that Roosevelt brought transparency on the profits of companies.
So that allows us all to be able to understand on an equal level playing field, 1 equals 1, no matter where and what company we're looking at, right? That would be your...
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Well, listen, this has been a great discussion. I encourage everybody to pick up the book. The book is Impact, Reshaping Capitalism to Drive Real Change. Where can, of course, people can, as I did, get the book at most popular bookstores. But if they want to learn more about you or ongoing work, where should they go?
Well, they can go to my own website, from which they can download free a guide to the impact revolution. But if they're technically inclined, they should go to the Harvard Business School site, IWA, Impact Weighted Accounts, to get a peep into the future of impact accounting.
Sir Ronald, it was such a treat. Thank you for taking time to speak with me. It was a great discussion, and I really enjoyed your book, and I encourage everyone to pick up a copy. And thank you so much for spending time and explaining this, and congratulations, and I wish you continued success.
Thank you very much. All the best, Michael.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of The Voice of Retail. Be sure and follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you enjoy podcasts so you don't miss out on the latest episodes, industry news, and insights. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a rating review, as it really helps us grow so that we continue to get amazing guests onto the show. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc, president of LeBlanc Company, Inc., and if you're looking for more content or want to chat, follow me on LinkedIn or visit my website at meleblanc.co. Until next time, stay safe, have a great week.